Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Benlian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. Human development is commonly described as the acquisition of capacities. The child learns to walk, speak, reason, cooperate, work, love, and project a future. This description is accurate, but it does not yet identify the principle that gives these capacities their developmental order. It tells us what appears, but not why one capacity must precede another, why some forms of learning become stable while others remain fragile, or why failures established early in life can reappear in increasingly complex forms throughout adulthood. The developmental process becomes more intelligible when psychology is placed within the broader organization of life. The human organism does not begin as a psychological abstraction. It begins as a living body that must preserve its integrity through continuous regulation. It must acquire nourishment, distinguish beneficial from harmful conditions, maintain internal balance, coordinate movement, repair injury, adapt to variation, and prepare for future demands. Psychological development does not arise independently of these physiological requirements. It emerges as their increasingly conscious, representational, relational, and volitional extension. The foundational proposition presented in this episode is that the major functions of psychological life can be understood as higher order analogs of the regulatory functions already present in physiology. Physiology preserves the organism's material integration. Psychology preserves, represents, and extends data integration through perception, memory, emotion, conception, valuation, purpose, and action. The two are not identical, nor should their relationship be reduced to a simplistic correspondence between organs and mental faculties. Rather, they reveal the recurrence of the same life-serving operations at different levels of organization. Development, from this perspective, is the process through which the human being progressively internalizes, differentiates, and volitionally extends the functions by which life preserves itself. Ancient philosophy frequently treated the human being as a microcosm, a concentrated expression of the wider order found in nature. Aristotle did not formulate this idea in precisely the later language of microcosm and macrocosm, yet his conception of life provides an indispensable foundation for it. For Aristotle, the soul was not a separate entity temporarily inhabiting the body. It was the form and actuality of a living organism. the organization through which matter becomes capable of nutrition, sensation, movement, appetite, and thought. The psychological powers of the human being were therefore not detached from biological life. They represented increasingly complex expressions of it. Nutrition preserved the organism. Sensation opened the organism to its environment. Appetite moved it toward or away from objects. Locomotion allowed it to alter its relation to surrounding conditions. Rationality made possible the identification of universals, the projection of consequences, and the deliberate direction of action. This hierarchical conception remains valuable because it suggests that higher capacity do not abolish lower ones. They depend upon them, incorporate them, and reorganize them within a wider context. Conceptual thought does not eliminate sensation. Purpose does not eliminate appetite. Volition does not eliminate automatic regulation. Instead, each higher level expands the range within which the organism can preserve and advance its life. The human being may therefore be understood not merely as a miniature copy of the universe, but as a living concentration of processes that appear throughout nature. Differentiation, exchange, regulation, coordination, preservation, adaptation, reproduction, and integration. In the human being, these processes eventually become objects of awareness. Life becomes capable of identifying the conditions of its own continuation. It can evaluate its regulatory processes, correct them, distort them, strengthen them, or consciously redirect them. Psychology begins where biological integration becomes capable of representing its own conditions and participating deliberately in its own development. The infant enters life unable to regulate most of the conditions upon which survival depends. The organism possesses many automatic physiological mechanisms, but it cannot independently secure nourishment, control environmental proximity, interpret its own internal signals, or organize action toward distant goals. Its first developmental field is therefore one of dependence. Hunger, cold, pain, fatigue, overstimulation, and separation are not initially experienced as clearly differentiated conditions. They are disruptions of the infant's total state. Hunger is not yet identified as hunger caused by the absence of food. It is experienced as distress. The infant does not know what has changed, why it has changed, or what action will restore integration. The caregiver supplies the missing regulatory sequence. The caregiver detects the disturbance, identifies its probable cause, selects a corrective action, and remains present long enough to determine whether balance has been restored. Feeding, holding, warming, repositioning, soothing, and protecting are not merely acts of physical maintenance. They form the earliest structure through which physiological disturbance becomes psychologically organized. Repeated experience gradually differentiates the field. A bodily disruption acquires a recognizable pattern. The pattern becomes associated with a particular response. The response becomes connected to relief. Relief becomes anticipated. Through these recurring sequences, the child begins to discover that stress has form, that form can be identified, and that disruption can be corrected. The caregiver initially functions as an external extension of the child's regulatory system. The child's nervous system is not isolated from the relational field, but develops within it. Regulation is first interpersonal before it becomes intrapersonal. What the child will eventually perform through self-awareness, judgment, and purposeful action is initially supplied through the attention, interpretation, and skill of another person. This gives attachment a deeper significance. Attachment is not merely emotional closeness or the desire to remain near a comforting figure. It is the first organized field within which the child learns whether disruption can be survived, understood, and resolved. Reliable care establishes an implicit expectation that disequilibrium is temporary and intelligible. The child learns that signals can be communicated, that causes can be discovered, and that action can restore order. Unreliable or incoherent care may establish a very different expectation. Distress may be met inconsistently, misinterpreted, ignored, or intensified. The child may then learn that bodily and emotional disruptors is causally obscure, that relief depends upon unpredictable external forces, or that the expression of need itself threatens the relationship upon which regulation depends. The child does not merely feel unsafe, the child begins to organize a theory of regulation around unreliable conditions. The earliest psychological integrations are therefore formed through the repeated relationship among disturbance, proximity, interpretation, response, and restoration. The four lessons of life, appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty, first appear physiologically. Appetite reveals that the organism is not self-sufficient. It must acquire values from beyond its present boundaries. Vulnerability reveals that the organism is open to influence and injury. Fragility reveals that its organization can be damaged or destroyed. Uncertainty reveals that the conditions affecting its continuity cannot be controlled completely in advance. These lessons are not abstract philosophical conclusions imposed upon experience later in life. They are encountered in the body before they are conceptualized by the mind. Appetite is first experienced as need. The infant is moved toward what it lacks before it can identify the value being sought. Vulnerability is first experienced as exposure. The child depends upon a world it cannot yet understand or comment. Fragility is first experienced in pain, exhaustion, illness, and loss of coordination. Uncertainty is first experienced in the interval between disturbance and response, when the child does not know whether relief will arrive. Healthy development does not eliminate these conditions. It transforms the individual's relation to them. Appetite becomes the recognition and pursuit of value. Vulnerability becomes selective openness and trust. Fragility becomes awareness of limits and the need for care, skill, and protection. Uncertainty becomes the field within which knowledge, preparation, experimentation, and courage become necessary. The psychological development of these lessons depends upon the success with which their physiological forms are first regulated. When need is repeatedly met through intelligible sequences, appetite becomes compatible with agency. When vulnerability is protected without being exploited, openness becomes compatible with independence. When fragility is treated as a condition requiring competence rather than shame, limitation becomes a motive for skill. When uncertainty is encountered within a stable relational field, the unknown becomes a domain for exploration rather than an undifferentiated threat. Development is therefore not a movement away from the basic conditions of life. It is the progressive integration of those conditions into increasingly complex forms of self-direction. Nutrition offers one of the clearest physiological analogs for psychological development. The organism must take in material from outside itself, break it down, distinguish useful from useless components, transform what it can use, distribute the resulting energy, and eliminate what cannot be incorporated. Psychological assimilation follows a comparable functional order. The individual encounters perceptual material, testimony, language, emotional reactions, cultural practices, and conceptual claims. These cannot be absorbed indiscriminately. They must be attended to, differentiated, evaluated, related to prior knowledge, and integrated into a wider context. A child who repeats words without understanding them has taken in material without fully assimilating it. A student who memorizes conclusions while remaining unable to reconstruct their basis possesses something analogous to undigested knowledge. The information is present, but it has not been transformed into an independently usable capacity. Healthy conceptual development requires that experience be broken into relevant units, related through causation, and reorganized into knowledge. This process depends upon reduction as much as integration. The learner must be able to return from a complex conclusion to the observations, distinctions, and intermediate steps that support it. Without this capacity, integration becomes accumulation rather than assimilation. Evasion corrupts this process. When a conclusion threatens a prior commitment, emotional dependency, or protected identity, the person may refuse to examine or assimilate the relevant evidence. The result is not simply ignorance, it is a disruption of epistemic metabolism. Experience is encountered but not properly transformed. Facts that cannot be integrated into the protected structure may be dismissed, distorted, or retained as unresolved tension. Just as physiological malnutrition can occur in the presence of food, psychological malnutrition can occur in the presence of abundant information. The decisive question is not how much material enters the system, but how successfully it is differentiated, assimilated, and converted into the energy of understanding and action. The immune system provides an especially important analog for psychological development because immunity depends upon discrimination. A healthy immune response must distinguish what belongs to the organism from what threatens it. It must respond proportionately, tolerate what is harmless, remember prior dangers, and seize mobilization when the threat has passed. Psychological integrity requires a comparable capacity. The individual must distinguish perception from interpretation, truth from falsehood, novelty from danger, disagreement from attack, complexity from contradiction, and external influence from independent judgment. This capacity may be called epistemic immunity, the defense of reality-oriented cognition against falsehood, manipulation, confusion, and evasion. The purpose of psychological immunity is not to protect every existing belief. Existing beliefs may be mistaken. Its function is to protect the person's capacity to remain in contact with reality, revise conclusions, maintain boundaries, and resist the substitution of another person's assertions for one's own judgment. Misintegration occurs when this protective function is reversed. A defensive belief, false identity, or evaded conclusion may become incorporated into the person's sense of self. Evidence that threatens the false structure is then experienced as though it threatened the organism. The psychological defense system begins to protect the error and attack the corrective information. This is analogous to autoimmunity. In physiological autoimmunity, the defense system attacks the organism's own tissues. In psychological autoimmunity, the person may attack valid perception, rational judgment, authentic emotion, or independent aspiration because these threaten an established misintegration. The person becomes divided against the very capacities required for restoration. The opposite failure resembles immunodeficiency. The individual lacks adequate boundaries or standards of discrimination and becomes excessively permeable to suggestion, approval, ideology, authority, or social pressure. False ideas are admitted without sufficient examination because the person has not developed the cognitive means or psychological independence required to reject them. Psychological health, therefore, cannot be identified with defensiveness. A strong psychological immune system is not one that rejects challenge. It is one that can remain open without becoming indiscriminate and can defend itself without becoming rigid. It preserves identity by maintaining reality contact, not by insulating the person from correction. Physiology continually regulates internal variables within ranges compatible with life. This regulatory activity is often described through homeostasis, the maintenance and restoration of functional balance. Yet living balance is not status. The organism is never motionless. It preserves continuity through continuous adjustment. Emotion performs a related psychological function. Emotions register the relationship between perceived conditions and the individual's values, expectations, and capacities. They indicate whether integration is being advanced, threatened, interrupted, or restored. Fear signals perceived danger. Anger signals obstruction or violation. Sadness registers loss. Joy encompasses successful value attainment or the restoration of coherence. Emotional regulation should therefore not be understood as the suppression of disturbance. A physiological system that concealed every sign of disequilibrium would not be healthy. Pain, inflammation, hunger, and fatigue provide information about the organism's condition. In the same way, emotions provide information about the individual's psychological relationship to reality. Healthy regulation requires identification rather than negation. The person must ask what value is implicated, what judgment produced the emotion, whether the judgment is accurate, and what action the situation requires. The emotion must be integrated into a wider context without being treated as either infallible revelation or meaningless interference. Misintegration arises when the signal is mistaken for the cause or when the person attempts to preserve equilibrium by avoiding the information carried by the emotion. Anxiety may be reduced temporarily through evasion, ritual, withdrawal, conformity, or dependence. The immediate decrease in discomfort reinforces the defensive pattern, even though the underlying contradiction remains unresolved. Psychological balance cannot be achieved by eliminating variation. It requires the capacity to move through variation without losing orientation. Emotional maturity consists not in remaining undisturbed, but in preserving the ability to identify, evaluate, and act while disturbance is present. Physiological regulation does not merely correct disruptions after they occur. Organisms also anticipate future demands and prepare for them. This anticipatory regulation is often described as allostasis. Energy is mobilized before exertion. Attention shifts before danger is fully present. The organism alters its current state in relation to projected future conditions. Purpose is the psychological and volitional extension of this anticipatory function. Through purpose, the individual organizes present action in relation to a future state that does not yet exist. The person accepts current effort, delay, uncertainty, and struggle because these are integrated into a projected sequence of value attainment. Purpose therefore performs a regulatory role across time. It maintains the continuity of action when immediate perception no longer supplies sufficient motivation. A child practices reading despite difficulty because mastery is anticipated. An apprentice repeats movements that initially feel awkward because future skill gives meaning to present correction. An entrepreneur allocates resources before profit exists because the projected enterprise organizes present decisions. Without purpose, psychological regulation remains excessively reactive. The person responds to present tension, immediate approval, discomfort, or opportunity without preserving a stable direction across changing conditions. Appetite remains detached from a hierarchy of values. Effort becomes intermittent. Emotional states determine action because no sufficiently integrated future orientation exists to regulate them. Purpose does not oppose physiological life. It extends its anticipatory logic into the conceptual and temporal domain. Through purpose, the human being becomes capable of regulating action in relation to possibilities rather than only present stimuli. The child's acquisition of motor control changes the structure of proximity. Before independent movement, the child depends upon others to hold a distance, acquire objects, and escape unwanted conditions. Crawling, reaching, grasping, standing, and walking transform the child from a largely stationary recipient of experience into an active explorer. Differentiation expands in proportion to motor control because movement multiplies the number of relations available for discovery. Near and far, heavy and light, stable and unstable, reachable and unreachable, safe and dangerous become increasingly precise distinctions through action. Perception becomes organized around affordances because the child learns what can be done with the objects and services encountered. Skill is the integration of differentiated movements into a reliable sequence directed toward a result. At first, action is effortful and fragmented. Attention is consumed by individual components. Through repetition, correction, and feedback, the movements become coordinated. Energy previously required to control basic elements become available for wider awareness and more complex purposes. This principle extends far beyond bodily movement. Intellectual, relational, artistic, and professional skills all depend upon the automation of lower order integrations. The experienced musician does not consciously calculate every finger movement. The capable parent does not reconstruct every element of care from first principles. The mature thinker can hold a complex context because many underlying distinctions have become stable and economically available. Skill is therefore a form of embodied integration. It is the conversion of repeated differentiation into coordinated power. As skill grows, the individual gains greater control over space, effort, and sequence. This expanded control provides the energy required to sustain purpose across time. The relationship between skill and purpose is reciprocal. Purpose directs the acquisition of skill, while skill provides the efficacy required to sustain purpose. A purpose without skill becomes aspiration without causal power. Skill without purpose becomes capacity without direction. The nervous system changes in response to repeated activation. Practice strengthens some pathways, weakens others, and reorganizes the efficiency with which signals are transmitted. This plasticity makes development possible, but it does not guarantee healthy development. Plasticity serves repetition. It stabilizes what the organism repeatedly performs, whether the pattern is integrative or defensive. A child who repeatedly explores, fails, receives guidance, adjusts, and succeeds strengthens a sequence in which uncertainty leads to investigation and competence. A child who repeatedly encounters error as humiliation may strengthen a different sequence in which uncertainty leads to concealment, dependence, or withdrawal. In adulthood, evasion can become similarly engraved. A contradiction appears. The person experiences threat. Attention narrows. A defensive reinterpretation is produced. Immediate tension decreases. The relief reinforces the sequence. With repetition, the pattern becomes rapid, automatic, and increasingly difficult to interrupt. The grooves of misintegration are not merely ideas stored in memory. They are embodied patterns of attention, emotional activation, expectation, interpretation, and action. The person may sincerely experience the defensive response as spontaneous or self-evident because the sequence has been consolidated below the threshold of deliberate reconstruction. This explains why psychological correction cannot be accomplished by verbal insight alone. A person may understand intellectually that a pattern is false while continuing to enact it automatically. Reintegration requires repeated experience in which the old sequence is interrupted and a new one is completed. Contradiction must become tolerable. Attention must remain open. The underlying judgment must be identified. A different action must be performed. The result must be experienced and retained. Plasticity makes corruption durable, but it also makes repair possible. The same capacity that stabilizes evasion can stabilize honesty. The same nervous system that learned helplessness can learn agency. The same individual who automatized withdrawal can, through repeated acts of reality-oriented engagement, establish a new developmental trajectory. Living systems possess mechanisms of repair. Injury does not always result in permanent collapse. Tissue reorganizes. Inflammation isolates damage, and new material is produced to restore functional continuity. Repair does not recreate the prior state perfectly. It preserves identity by reorganizing around what has occurred. Psychological reintegration operates similarly. Failure, betrayal, loss, error, and trauma disrupt prior organization. The person's assumptions about self, others, causation, or the future may no longer correspond to experience. The disruption creates a demand for reorganization. Healthy reintegration requires that the event be admitted into awareness, differentiated into its relevant elements, evaluated accurately, and placed within a wider temporal context. Responsibility must be distinguished from guilt, danger from memory, loss from total annihilation, and present possibility from past limitation. Defensive avoidance may preserve short-term functioning by isolating the injury from conscious examination. Yet, what is excluded from integration continues to influence attention, emotion, and action. The person becomes organized around avoiding contact with the unresolved material. The injury is no longer merely something that happened. It becomes a hidden regulator of psychological life. Repair requires more than returning to a previous condition. Developmental reintegration must produce a more differentiated and resilient organization than existed before the disruption. The individual incorporates the new knowledge, revises expectations, strengthens boundaries, and develops capacities that were previously absent. The mature self is not one that has never been injured or mistaken. It is one that has repeatedly restored coherence through reality-oriented reconstruction. Living systems must eliminate what cannot and should not be retained. Physiological excretion prevents the accumulation of unusable or harmful material. Psychological life requires an analogous function, but its form is more complex. The person must relinquish obsolete beliefs, failed strategies, false associations, unresolved contradictions, and identities that no longer correspond to reality. Reduction performs this function within the IIR cycle. Induction gathers relevant instances. Integration identifies the common structure and organizes it into a wider whole. Reduction returns the integration to its constituent units and causal sequence in order to test its validity. Reduction is therefore not destruction for its own sake. It is the method by which integration is prevented from hardening into dogma. It allows the person to ask what observations support a conclusion, what distinctions were required, what assumptions enter the sequence, and whether the resulting structure remains commensurable with reality. A healthy psychological system must be capable both of retaining and relinquishing. Memory without reduction produces accumulation. Conviction without reduction produces rigidity. Loyalty without reduction produces submission to inherited errors. Identity without reduction produces fear of growth. The ability to abandon a false integration is not evidence that the self has failed. It is evidence that the self values reality more highly than the preservation of a mistaken structure. The progression from childhood to mature adulthood can now be understood as a sequence of regulatory transformations. In childhood, the central task is the establishment of basic somatic, relational, perceptual, and motor integration. Regulation is initially supplied from outside and gradually internalized. The child learns that needs have objects, actions have consequences, movements alter proximity, and distress can be differentiated rather than merely endured. In adolescence, the individual confronts the problem of psychological boundaries. The developing person must distinguish inherited values from independently validated convictions, relational belonging from submission, and emotional intensity from final judgment. Epistemic immunity becomes central because the adolescent is increasingly exposed to competing claims, identities, authorities, and social pressures. The task is not merely separation from the parent, but the development of an internal standard capable of regulating influence. In adulthood, the central problem becomes the integration of purpose, skill, intimacy, work, and responsibility. The individual must coordinate multiple timescales and relational contexts without fragmenting into incompatible selves. Regulation must now occur across commitments rather than merely within isolated tasks. The adult must preserve identity while remaining open to correction, sustain purpose while adapting to changing conditions, and enter intimate relationships without surrendering judgment or independence. In mature adulthood, development increasingly takes the form of generativity. Biological reproduction becomes only one expression of a wider process through which knowledge, values, skills, institutions, and cultural forms are transmitted. The mature person does not merely preserve personal integration, but contributes to the developmental conditions of others. Leadership, teaching, parenting, craftsmanship, scholarship, and institution building all extend the individual's integration beyond the limits of a single lifespan. At each stage, a function first supplied by physiology or relationship becomes increasingly representational, conceptual, and volitional. The direction is from automatic regulation to co-regulation, from co-regulation to self-regulation, and from self-regulation to generative integration. The physiological psychological continuum clarifies the distinction among integration, misintegration, and disintegration. Integration occurs when differentiated elements are coordinated according to the requirements of life and reality. Signals are accurately interpreted. Boundaries remain permeable but discriminating. Emotion informs without ruling. Purpose organizes action across time. Skill converts intention into causal efficacy. Error can be identified and corrected without destroying identity. Misintegration occurs when elements are organized into a functioning but distorted structure. The person may appear stable because the defensive system successfully reduces immediate tension. Yet the stability depends upon avoidance, false premises, external validation, compulsive routine, or the suppression of relevant information. Misintegration often mimics health. Compliance can mimic cooperation. Emotional numbness can mimic calm. Routine can mimic purpose. Dependency can mimic attachment. Defensiveness can mimic strength. Accumulated information can mimic knowledge. The structure functions, but it functions by protecting itself from the corrective contact required for further development. Disintegration occurs when the person can no longer coordinate the relevant elements into a workable whole. Attention fragments, emotional signals become overwhelming or inaccessible. Purpose collapses, relationships become incoherent, and action loses continuity. What had been held together by defensive compensation may separate under pressure. Developmental assessment must therefore ask more than whether a person is functioning. It must ask how the functioning is achieved, what information must be excluded to preserve it, how much energy the structure consumes, whether it remains open to correction, and whether it generates greater capacity over time. The IIR cycle, induction, integration, and reduction, provides the mechanism through which physiological regulation becomes psychological development. Induction begins with repeated contact. The child encounters concrete instances of hunger and feeding, movement and consequence, separation and return, effort and mastery. Regularities are gradually extracted from variation. The organism discovers what recurs. Integration organizes these regularities into a functional whole. The child does not merely remember isolated feelings, but develops an expectation of care. The student does not merely reproduce isolated examples, but grasps a principle. The apprentice does not merely imitate individual emotions, but coordinates them into skill. Reduction validates the integration by returning it to the sequence from which it arose. The learner tests whether the principle applies, whether the movement remains stable under variation, whether the expectation corresponds to current conditions, and whether the conclusion can be reconstructed from evidence. Development becomes robust when all three movements remain active. Induction without integration produces disconnected experience. Integration without reduction produces premature certainty. Reduction without renewed integration produces fragmentation. The cycle must remain recursive because every completed integration creates the basis for a wider one. The developmental process is therefore spiral rather than linear. The individual returns repeatedly to appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty, but at increasingly complex levels. The child encounters appetite as hunger. The adolescent encounters it as desire and ambition. The adult encounters it as the need to select among competing values. The mature person encounters it as the question of what should be created and transmitted beyond the self. Each return contains the earlier form while expanding its scope. The proposed physiological analogues should not be treated as decorative metaphors. They can serve as a disciplined method of inquiry if each correspondence is tested functionally. For any proposed psychological capacity, we may ask what variable it preserves, what deviation it detects, what standard guides correction, what boundary it maintains, what action it mobilizes, what feedback confirms success, and what pathology appears when the function overreacts, underreacts, or acts upon the wrong object. Nutrition preserves the organism by assimilating material. Psychological assimilation preserves cognition by transforming experience into knowledge. Immunity preserves biological identity through discrimination. Epistemic immunity preserves psychological integrity through reality-oriented judgment. Homeostasis restores functional balance. Emotional regulation restores orientation without suppressing information. Allostasis prepares for future demand. Purpose organizes present action toward projected values. Motor coordination integrates movement. Skill integrates differentiated action into efficacy. Plasticity stabilizes repeated pathways. Character stabilizes repeated patterns of attention, valuation, and choice. Repair restores continuity after injury. Reintegration restores coherence after error, loss, or contradiction. Reproduction extends life through generation. Mature psychological development extends integration through teaching, creation, leadership, and culture. The recurrence of these functions suggests that psychology is not an arbitrary collection of mental phenomena. It is the study of how the fundamental requirements of life become conscious, relational, conceptual, volitional, and temporally extended in the human being. This orientation also provides psychology with a possible unit perspective. The primary unit is not an isolated sensation, behavior, emotion, or belief, but the regulatory act through which a differentiated condition is identified and coordinated within the organism's continuing integration. Psychological phenomena can then be examined according to whether they increase or decrease the individual's capacity to preserve reality contact, organize energy, maintain boundaries, correct error, sustain purpose, and generate further integration. Human development begins before the individual can speak, reason, or choose. It begins in the living organism's continuous requirement to preserve its integrity. The body takes in, discriminates, regulates, anticipates, coordinates, repairs, and reproduces. These functions establish the first conditions from which psychological life emerges. The caregiver initially joins this biological process as an external regulator. Through relational proximity, physiological disturbance becomes perceptually differentiated and emotionally organized. Through movement, the child gains control over space. Through language and conception, the child gains control over temporal continuity. Through purpose, the developing person organizes present action toward future states. Through reduction, the person validates and corrects the integrations upon which action depends. The developmental stages therefore trace an ascent from physiological regulation through relational co-regulation toward conscious and volitional self-integration. What life forms performs automatically, the human being gradually learns to represent, evaluate, and direct. The deepest significance of this process is not that psychology merely resembles physiology. It is that both express the same fundamental imperative through different levels of organization. Life must preserve identity while remaining open to exchange. It must distinguish without isolating, assimilate without dissolving, adapt without surrendering form, and change without losing continuity. The human being is the existence in whom these operations become capable of conscious participation. He can discover the principles by which his integration is maintained. He can also evade them, corrupt them, or reorganize them around falsehood. His development depends upon whether the regulatory functions inherited from life become extended through reason, purpose, skill, and independent judgment. The foundational principle of the developmental process may therefore be stated as follows. Development is the progressive internalization, differentiation, and volitional extension of the regulatory functions through which life preserves and advances its integration. From this perspective, psychological maturity is not merely the possession of knowledge, emotional control, social adjustment, or productive competence. It is the condition in which the individual becomes increasingly capable of serving as the conscious regulator of his own integration, preserving fidelity to reality while transforming experience into the material of further growth. Integration is thus not one achievement among others. It is the developmental form through which the living organism becomes a self-directed human being. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.